Welcome to the first Coffee and Conversation of 2025. Happy New Year, everybody. So happy to see a nice crowd. It's been a little quiet the last couple of weeks, so welcome back, everybody. I'm so happy to welcome back John Hubricks, history professor at Framingham University, and he's here today to talk about Boston versus New York City, one of our favorite rivalries, this time in terms of the subway system. Thank you so much, John.
My pleasure. Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate that. Thank you for coming out. I was surprised when I heard how big the turnout was going to be when Debbie emailed me. So I guess everybody was bored of sitting around their houses, right, and wanted to get out. Also wanted to congratulate all of you. In 30 plus years of teaching and doing talks like this, I think this is the first time that the front rows filled up before the back rows filled up. No matter classrooms, faculty meetings, everywhere you go, it's at the church. Yeah, there's another good one. Exactly. You always have to, come on, there's seats up front, there's seats up front. So there are actually two up here if anybody is still looking for a seat. But anyway. I wanted to, first of all, I'm getting used to using a microphone. I'm not accustomed to it. So please bear with me if it gets too close or too far away. And if you can't hear me, just wave me down. It means it might be drifting like that, and I want to avoid that. So please don't hesitate if you can't hear me, and I'll do my best not to get it too close to my mouth as well. Going to talk about the rivalry between Boston and New York City to build the first subway in the United States. And I will give you a hint, Boston won. Yeah, by about 4 years they beat New York City. So I'm giving that away. But so talk is kind of arranged in three parts today. One is a little bit of background about American cities and why transportation was needed, why subways were needed. And then talk a little bit about the particulars of the construction of the Boston, what becomes the T, what we know as the T, first constructed. And then lastly, talk about the construction of the New York City subway system as well. So by the middle of the 19th century, it was clear that cities needed to do something about congestion. This was true of European cities like London and Berlin, and was certainly true of places like Boston and New York and even Chicago. The cities had grown dramatically over the course of the 19th century. For example, Boston in 1800 had a population of about 25,000. By 1890, Boston had a population of 448,000. So 90 years, whatever percentage of growth that would be. I'm a historian, which means I'm math challenged, so I didn't even try to figure that out. New York City grew from about 60,000 on 1.5 square miles in 1800 to 3.8 million on 91 square miles by 1900. Now that's a little bit of apples and oranges because in 1898 is when the 5 boroughs were brought together to create New York City. So that's a little bit of a tougher one to understand or quantify. Even more dramatically, Chicago, only time I'll mention Chicago today, was founded in 1833. And by 1900, it had a population of 1.7 million people. Unlike Chicago, though, Boston and New York had limited geography and older infrastructure that they had to consider, which Chicago didn't. And in the case of Boston specifically, the Boston Common was the thing that nobody wanted to touch, and I'll touch on that a little bit more as we're talking. So congestion in these cities was horrible. While if we could magically bring someone from the 19th century back to sit in one of our traffic jams, they would no doubt be amazed by the vehicles that we had and by air conditioning and radios and Bluetooth and phones ringing and air conditioning. I think I said that. And sensors that pick up traffic in our rear view mirrors and all of that kind of stuff. The technology would really wow them, but the congestion that we see here somewhere, I have no idea where this is other than somewhere close to Quincy. The congestion like this, it didn't look like this, but they could certainly understand that congestion. A journey of a couple blocks could take quite some time as pedestrians, horse-drawn vehicles competed for the roadways, and quite literally they competed to occupy that space. Boston and New York and other cities all had some form of public transportation in the late 19th century. Public transportation started out, there's examples of congestion in a 19th century city. I especially like, I know especially for those of you in back or on camera, can't see, but this horse and buggy here just cutting right in front of the streetcar on the right-hand photo as well. So the congestion they were familiar with, and the public transportation that they had early was a vehicle called an omnibus. And this is an example of an omnibus. You can see it's pulled by horses, a two-decker. This one probably held 15 or 20 people. By the late 19th century, these were more common, but even then they still only had about a capacity of 30 people on them. So they had all of this public transportation. You can see they were all drawn by horses at this point. These, I know they look incredibly primitive by our standards, but by middle of or latter decades of the 19th century, these were cutting edge kind of things. But they quickly became too small as the cities expanded and couldn't keep up with the growing population and with the growing demand. And there was it was tough to kind of rationalize these systems because we think of public transportation as being publicly owned, right? It's owned by the city or the county or the state or whatever, in the case of Amtrak by the federal government. But all of these transportation companies were privately owned. And consequently, there was a lot of competition. There was no regulation. There was no route regulation. So sometimes they would be these omnibuses, the drivers would be racing to get to a stop to pick people up to get ahead of their competition. And can you imagine being in one of those things, being pulled at full speed through a city street that was, if you were lucky, it was cobblestone. It might be muddy, it might be slippery, and so forth. So it was pretty scary. The omnibus passengers, it was scary for them to be on something like that. They didn't have, they also would have to take several omnibuses sometimes to get to a destination, which if you're thinking, well, that's just like the T or the metro in Washington, D.C. or the trains in New York, yeah, you're right. But the difference in the 19th century was because these were all privately owned, every time you got onto an omnibus, you paid your fare. You got off the omnibus, got onto another omnibus. You didn't get a free transfer. You got another fare to pay. So public transportation was pretty expensive for poor people. For working class people, it was really expensive. But there was no push for rationalization because all of these companies were owned by individuals who were making money. They didn't really care about the consumer. They didn't care about the public. They were making money. They didn't want to give out free transfers. They didn't want to rationalize anything because then they would lose money. So there was no push for any kind of solution, at least for a while. And these omnibuses, as I said, it could be scary to be riding on them. It could be pretty scary to be on the street when one of these came running by. It wasn't uncommon for people to get hit as they were going by with these things racing down the street. This is a quote from someone in New York City from the 1840s, and this is this person's description of trying to cross Broadway, and quote, "You must button your coat tight about you. See that your shoes are secure at the heels. Settle your hat firmly on your head. Look up the street and down the street to see what carts and carriages are upon you, and then run for your life. That was the 1840s, trying to cross Broadway, which is, not dissimilar to today, although today we have pedestrian laws. But as I was watching that, did any of you watch Grace and Frankie, the TV show Grace and Frankie? Remember the episode where they were all teaming up to get the crosswalk light to hold long enough so they could cross? So that kind of reminded me of that episode, at any rate. So there was no push to get this done because they were making too much money off of it. And there was no pressure, if you will, for this to happen. So the other thing that becomes a problem as the cities grow is the dirt that was generated by the dust, the congestion. You can see they were all pulled by horses. And while today urban areas are not known for their cleanliness, they were exponentially worse 100 plus years ago. And one of the reasons that they were exponentially worse was because there were so many horses in all of these cities. A lot of streets were not paved. Some were cobblestone, but others were just dirt or mud. Not only horses, but it wasn't uncommon to have animals like pigs or chickens in cities. Horses pulled not only the omnibuses here, the public conveyances, but also thousands of delivery wagons. They also were there for private transportation as well. And in fact, one of the reasons that it took so long for horses to be replaced in some of the delivery systems in the U.S. Was because horses knew the routes, so drivers could just get up there and get the horses going, and then the horse would know which tavern to stop at next to deliver the beer or ice or whatever they were delivering. And of course, in a truck, you can't do that. But anyway, horses were becoming a big problem. In Boston, it was estimated that there were about 4,500 horses in 1900, and in New York City, that number was closer to 100,000 horses in the city. Now, here is a fun fact about horses. Horses produce a prodigious amount of manure, as much as 30 to 50 pounds a day. About 60% of that is solid, and about 40% of that is liquid. So I can do a little bit of math. 4,500 horses at 35 pounds a day is 157,500 pounds of horse manure a day in New York, or that's in Boston. That was in Boston, excuse me, which converts to just under 79 tons of manure to clean up every day. So you can see how messy those were. If it's deposited on cobblestones, it could be cleared up relatively easily unless it was trampled. But if it was deposited on a muddy street, it just added to the mess. And horses had bags that they could collect the feces usually that they would expel. But there was, of course, nothing to do with the urine that ended up on the streets. They couldn't catch that. And as we progress later into the 19th century, the horse manure issue takes on another negative effect for the horse owners. Middle of the 19th century, they could get about $4 a pound for horse poop, which I think, I'm not sure. If you want to ask me a question and stump me, here's the question. I'm pretty sure it was used for fuel. I think they took it and dried it. The people that purchased it took it and dried it and could use it to burn as fuel. I think that's what they did with it. I'm not positive about that. But so they're getting $4 a pound for it, which is pretty good to help keep, because you got to feed the horses too, of course. By the end of the century, they were only getting just over $1 a pound for it. So that made the horses even more expensive for upkeep. So there began to be reasons. Horses were no longer as practical. Okay, this is like driving an old car, right? That's just not as fuel efficient anymore as some of the newer cars. In the late 1880s, there was also a stable fire in New York City. And of course, they had to keep all of these horses someplace. So there were big stables in cities, every city, not just New York or Boston. And with all of the hay and so forth, they were real tinderboxes. And this fire in New York City killed 1,155 horses in one fire. Only 45 horses survived. It also destroyed most of the railroad cars or the omnibuses that were in the building as well. Almost 150 cars were destroyed. It spread to other buildings, which damaged more property. And so these big these big stables in cities were just too dangerous. And a lot of people didn't really care about the company losses or the horses, which is a tragedy. But they were concerned, of course, about their own homes, their own businesses that were there as well. So that became, the danger of fire was another thing that began to move horses and push for a different solution to public transportation. Then lastly, or the last thing at least that I'll mention, was that in 1888, there was what's called the Great Blizzard struck the east coast of the United States. And it dropped anywhere from 10 to 60 inches of snow up and down the East Coast. And the worst of it hit New York City, where they got those numbers of 60 inches or whatever. That's what they got in New York City, which, as you would expect, shut down the city for several days in mid-March. The street omnibuses like this were not running, nothing was running, and everybody was saying, well, gee, if we had this underground, we would be able to move much better, and the city would not be as slowed down as it was by this big blizzard. So all of these things were happening around the in the 1880s, 1890s. People were realizing that something needed to be done. This outmoded form of transportation it was outmoded, but they didn't have any good solutions yet. And there were a few problems that they faced that had to be overcome. One of them I've already mentioned, which was the street railway owners, who didn't want any sort of rationalization, didn't want any of this to happen because they realized they would lose money on the deal and they would lose control. So they had to overcome these people who were typically among the richest and wealthiest people in these cities. They also had to overcome superstition. People didn't want to travel underground. It was scary. That's where you go when you're dead. And all the superstition, like, you don't want to walk through a graveyard at night, right? That kind of thing. So they had to overcome this superstition of using underground transportation. And, when you stop and think about it, isn't that just sort of typical of humans? Like, don't sit in front of the TV, you'll go blind. Cell phones cause brain tumors. Microwaves, don't stand too close to the microwave. When they first came out, you'll have all kinds of problems. So kind of a typical human reaction, I guess. People are people regardless of time and place. There was also a lot of concern about harm to surface buildings. People said, well, if you build this, what's going to happen to our structures that are already here? Mentioned the Boston Common, concern about trees, what's going to happen to sort of the natural beauty. And then lastly, there was concern because the technology really wasn't there yet to do all of this. Because how are you going to, in the 1880s, pull a train underground? Have to use either horses or you have to use steam locomotives, billowing smoke and steam. And so it wasn't very clean. And people were concerned about that. People were concerned about air quality. London, by this point, had a subway system that was running on steam engines. They tried to use smokeless coal, but it still was a mess to do. So there were these technological problems that had to be overcome. But as we all know, necessity is the mother of invention, and these problems were overcome. So this brings us to the story of Boston and New York in their quest to build railroads. And these two guys are central to our story. The one on the left, Henry, was in Boston, and William on the left, or excuse me, William on the right, was in New York City, and they were brothers. They grew up in the Boston area. They grew up very wealthy. Their father was a shipping magnate who gave them the best of everything. William was studious and became a lawyer. He moved to New York City, and then he made even a better career move than becoming a lawyer or being born into Boston wealth. He married a Vanderbilt. Good career move, right? Marry a Vanderbilt. I think she was the granddaughter of Cornelius, the founder of the Vanderbilt dynasty. And he became the corporation counsel for New York City, and he comes back into our story a little bit later on. Henry stayed in Boston, took over the family shipping firm, and added to the family wealth, and started to buy up land in Brookline. And eventually, in 1887, he pushed through a plan to consolidate several private omnibus railroad companies in Boston and created a railroad called the West End Railroad, and that was in 1887. Now, Henry was a forward-thinking businessman, and he recognized the problems of all of the competition that was going on, of the racing in the streets, and not the Springsteen song, and all of the problems. So he decides that he's going to rationalize the West End Railroad, and by that I mean he looks at it and creates a unified service, so there's not overlap, there's not overlapping routes, and so forth. He also does something that the working class of Boston love. He says everything's a nickel and you get a transfer. So if you want to go from, the podium all the way to the back, you don't have to make 3 stops and pay a nickel each way. You got to get off and just present your transfer, and you can get on the next omnibus and head on to your destination. So he does all of this. He's very popular. He is also becoming even richer because the consolidation and rationalization of the railroad really is beneficial to him as well. I'm calling it a railroad because most of it was on rails, but it was still pulled by horses. Okay, some of it was omnibuses that just roamed, could go wherever, but some of it was on rails that were pulled by horses. So Henry Whitney there created the West End Railroad, as I said, which at the time was the largest surface railroad in the world, or the largest city railroad, I should say, in the world, not in terms of miles, but biggest public transportation in a city, okay? But as I said, it was still powered by horses, and to move underground had to have a better form of transportation. So this is where enter a man named Frank Sprague on the left there. Has anybody heard that name before? Anybody? Sprague? I didn't know. You never know who. Some of you might have worked in the industry and known who he was. He was the father basically of electric motors and inventing electric motors. And so he was a graduate of Annapolis in 1878, graduated about 7th in his class out of 36 from the Naval Academy. And even while at the academy, he'd started to make a name for himself. He'd done a couple of minor inventions using electric motors that could be used on ships. And so he had a real talent for invention and was very good at it. So he serves in the Navy, does his requisite 5 or 6 years, resigns in 1883, and takes a job working at Edison Labs with Thomas Edison. and they don't like one another very much because Edison wants him to work on what Edison wants him to work on, and Sprague just wants to work on electric motors. That's what he was really passionate about. So he leaves after about a year with Edison and forms the Sprague Electric Railway and Motor Company. And he works solely on inventing electric motors that his ultimate goal is railroads, to get them into railroads. But along the way, he invents electric motors that begin to run printing presses, which is revolutionary. Way back when, I was a journalism major in college, and I remember talking a lot about powered printing presses and how those are such a big deal in the evolution of the newspapers and magazines that were circulating. So the presses, looms for clothing production, which would have been important here in New England, especially important, and elevators, the motors that run elevators up and down. And that we're so used to all of those things, but particularly elevators are pretty revolutionary because up until that time, buildings never got more than 4 or 5, maybe 6 stories high, because 4, 5, 6 stories is about as high as someone can climb comfortably before they, need to sit down and catch their breath before they take off on the next, leg up the steps. So it allows for buildings to get higher, which is incredibly important for the development of the urban landscape as tall buildings can become more common. So anyway, Sprague is working on all of this, and in 1887 he gets a contract with Richmond, Virginia to electrify its city railway system, which he accomplished. It took him a long time, or it didn't take him a long time, took him a couple of years, but a lot of hard work, a lot of failures, near bankruptcy. But he finally succeeded in delivering 40 cars powered by electric motors that could navigate the terrain in the hills of Richmond, Virginia. Revolutionary. Okay, this is absolutely revolutionary. It's, we don't know the name Sprague like we know Henry Ford or Thomas Edison or Jonas Salk or some of the others who invented things that were really important. But Sprague should be up in that pantheon of really important inventors because he really did change the way Americans lived at the time. So this contract with Richmond that Sprague was able to fulfill created the largest electric railway in the country. And a year later, in the late 1880s, Henry Whitney, along with his team, his bankers, his engineers, and so forth, are in Richmond to watch a demonstration where Sprague had continued to work on his motors and work on their efficiency. And Sprague ran a train of 20 cars up a steep hill as an experiment to demonstrate to Whitney that the system was powerful enough to operate the West End Railroad. And Sprague immediately got a contract from Whitney to begin to electrify the West End Railroad. So Whitney is really on the cutting edge here in electrification. And 2 years later, about 4 or 5 years later, in 1895, Boston voters approved about $5 million to build a combined elevated and subway system that would be about, the initial Boston system was 1.8 miles long. It was not very long at all. There you can see the initial Boston system there from Public Garden to Haymarket Square along that route. So as I said, it was going to be 1.8 miles. The first phase resembled an L, this part running. Here I have to keep all the streets straight, so I have to look at my notes here to make sure I get everything right. The L running from Public Garden near Boylston and Arlington Streets to the corner of Boylston and Tremont Streets, and then turning left to the corner of Park across from the Park Street Church, which would be right kind of in the middle of the map. The second phase then would take the system from Park Street over to North Station and Haymarket Square. This was a relatively easy system to build because they did not have to do any tunneling in this system. They did what is called a cut and cover, which is basically you just dig a hole or you dig a trench right over the street, and then you dig it as deep as you need it, and then you build the walls and build a ceiling and seal it off, and you're just below the street level basically. So it's a pretty easy build. Okay, the contract to build the first section of what becomes the T was won by a company called Jones and Meehan out of Jamaica Plain, and here's where we see the good old Massachusetts political corruption kick in here. They submitted what was the second lowest bid for this construction, and the actual low bid was submitted by a firm from New York. But then somehow, magically, apparently, their bid got lowered by about $1,000 to make it less than the actual low bid. And the nepotism kicks in because Meehan's brother was a banker and one of the wealthiest men in Jamaica Plain and was involved with deciding who got the contract for this. So this local firm got the contract. I have in parentheses in my notes here, nepotism at its best here. Construction began in late March 1895, and just about 10 days before that, the Boston Public Library opened to great fanfare in its present building in Copley Square. Many of you have probably been there. And it opened to big party, big celebration, and to Bostonians, the new library was just one more indication of how Boston was really the intellectual capital of the country. It was the cultural capital of the country in their minds, hence the hub, why Boston is sometimes called the hub city. So just about 2 weeks after the new library opened, the subway construction started. The commons were used as a staging area. I couldn't find any good pictures, but the commons was filled with Quonset huts and so forth for construction. Kind of like near where I live now. I live close to 495, and all the exit areas have been turned into construction staging areas with gravel and outhouses and all kinds of stuff because they're doing a lot of construction on 495 near where I live. Anyway, as I said, this was a trench, not a tunnel, so it took less dirt, fewer steps, less danger to buildings. But they went through and they measured all the buildings. They took sketches of all the trees. They made sure where everything was so that if there was any damage, they would know exactly how to replace it. They would have a record of, yes, this building sank 3 inches, or it's leaning this way or that way because of construction. So every tree along the common was plotted as to where it was, and all of the trees that could be removed were removed and put back exactly where they had been taken from, if they could manage that. There were some trees that were simply too big that they just had to cut down, and just because they were too big, they couldn't be transferred, and or couldn't be transplanted, I should say, and so they were afraid that they would die. So the tunnels were dug, masonry walls were built. Here's one example, or here's what it looked like in Boston. This is right at Park Street. This is the Park Street station, basically. There's the church right on the corner. If you keep going down, I think that's Tremont. If you go down there a few more blocks, you're at Government Center, if that kind of orients you to where that photo was taken. And you can see the trench that they're building there and how they're routing the surface streetcars around that particular part of the trench. I think there's one more. Yeah, there's same basic area, just a little bit different angle. And again, you see the church. That's pretty much right where, if you've ever taken it in and gotten off at Park Street, that's right where you would have gotten off and come up onto the surface. Of course, the common be to the left as you're looking at that photo. Most of the common would be out there. So they built it. This trench method was used to cut it. Lots of steel, you can see, were used there. This was ventilated with big fans inside the stations that would draw air from the tunnels and expel it through the surface to keep the air clean down there. The West End Railway was granted the contract to run the subway. So it was a joint project, both private and public, with the city getting 4% of the revenue from the railroad. At least once it was up and running, it would get 4%. And again, the idea of one fare with transfers was used to make it very cost effective for a lot of blue collar people who were going to be some of the early riders of the railroad, of the T, as it eventually became called. On March 4th, 1897, the worst disaster of the project took place. This was also a day, I'll quiz you. Anybody know what would have happened on March 4th, 1897? I'll give you a hint. There's going to be another one in a week or two. Close. The inauguration. It was later then. It was in March. It was in March back then, and then after the 36 election, they changed it to January. So presidents up until 36 got sworn in March. So certifying the vote is close. So you get a silver star, not a gold star, but a silver star for the day. So. Anyway, it was the day McKinley was inaugurated. But what happened in Boston was a disaster because someone likely nicked a gas line in the construction early in that morning of March 4th, 1897. And people all morning were saying that they smelled gas, they were suspicious, but with all the construction going on, the gas company was getting like 20 complaints a day about gas, smelling of gas in downtown areas. So they weren't paying much attention to this. And about noon, a spark, don't know what, might have been a cigar butt, might have been a spark thrown by one of the streetcars. You can't see any up there, but a streetcar, who knows? But a spark clicked or hit the gas and it exploded. And 10 people were killed by the explosion, and a couple of horses were killed as well. So that was obviously a tragedy, and that was the worst tragedy in the building of the initial building of the Boston subway. Amazingly, only 4 other people were killed building the initial phase of construction in Boston. So only 14 people killed, which I know I say only 14, but I was trained as a labor historian and I've studied injuries and deaths on the job, and 14 people killed in a project like this is pretty good. When railroads would walk into hiring stations for trainmen and say, how many of you have experience? And people would hold up their hands like this or like this, and they'd, okay, well, that guy's got experience because he's, missing 3 fingers. So that was the attitude of companies towards injuries. So only 14, I'm not diminishing the tragedy of that for those families involved, but in the overall scheme of things, it seemed like a pretty small number. So a second disaster was averted in August of 1897, just before the T opened, when 2 workers were down in a hole. they saw a crane beginning to collapse, and they scrambled out of the hole just before the thing collapsed and dropped a huge multiple-ton granite block into this hole, and these guys escaped without any injuries. So they were really lucky. So the first section, this 1.8-mile section, opened with minimal fanfare on September 1, 1897. It came in at $4.2 million out of an estimated $5 million cost. So typical trip from Public Garden by Arlington Street to the Boylston Street station and then on to Park Street took only 3 or 4 minutes. On the surface, at least, it took about 10 minutes to do that. And it's estimated that on the first day, that somewhere between 200 and 250,000 people rode on that little 1.8-mile stretch on the first day. So it might have opened with a minimal fanfare, but there was a lot of interest in riding it. If you remember my figure from the start, where I said Boston's population was around 460, 470,000, a little under half of the people in the city rode the subway on the first day just for that experience. So clearly it was very popular. Trains were electric in the new subway in Boston. They'd figured out how to have a motor. By this point, Sprague and others had figured out how to have a motor on each car controlled by the engineer, so that if one motor died, the entire train, the entire list of, train of cars didn't have to stop. So they continued to, I just went blank on the word. They improved the invention. That's not the word refine the invention. That's, I guess, what I was trying to come up with. So along with this, Boston was building elevated rails, which actually remained open until 2004. And then last thing about Boston, one fun fact that I looked up, it started to be called the T in the mid-1960s, which was when the MBTA was created as an entity, and that's when it started to be called the T, which actually surprised me. When I was doing my research on that, I thought this is going to be like 1919 or something like that, but no, 1960s is when it started to be called the T. Okay, so that concludes Boston. So 1897, Boston opens the first subway, 1.8 miles. Of course, it's built out tremendously since then, but that was it, and it beat New York by several years. And one of the reasons at least, that Boston was ahead of New York was because of Will Whitney here on the right side. Now, as I said, when we last left Mr. Whitney, he was married to a Vanderbilt in the Corporation Council for New York City. Well, he was friendly with Grover Cleveland, so he was Secretary of the Navy during the first Grover Cleveland administration, which was in the 1880s. Cleveland left office in 1889, so the last half of the 80s. He's in Washington. He comes back to New York and quickly asserts himself, becomes, like his brother, one of the scions of the street railway industry in New York. And in the late 1880s, early 1890s, when he's back in New York gaining power, he's thwarting everything to try that all of the efforts to build railroads, he's thwarting because he's going to lose money. He's making money now. He doesn't want to lose all of this. So in the late 1880s, New York appointed a commission to look into a subway system. It was chaired by another kind of famous name, William Steinway, as in the pianos. Yeah, he was the founder of the piano building dynasty. And he was put in charge of this commission to look into it. They put out bids, but nobody bid on it. They didn't want to, partly because Whitney was kind of behind the scenes threatening people and telling them not to bid and whatever. So finally, in the 1896, New York City voted to build a 21 miles combination subway and elevated railroad. But who would build it? The contractor would have to invest $7 million of his own money to do this, and he would have to run the railroad as well, or at least find somebody to run it. So that took out a lot of potential bidders because a lot of people didn't have the $7 million up front. Finally, in 1900, the city opened a second round of bids, and this time got two bids that were viable, one for $39 million and one for $34 million. And the winner was a contractor named John McDonald to build the railroads. Now, just a quick mention about the contract. Part of that $34 million bid went to the Carnegie Steel Company for $10 million. And they delivered 72,945 tons of steel to build the New York system. Some of that went to rails, of course. So to try to conceptualize all of that, right? Because how do we conceptualize almost 73,000 tons of steel? That would be enough steel to lay a single line of railroad tracks for 600 miles. And if you're still having trouble conceptualizing that, according to my AI assistant, Raleigh, North Carolina is about 600 miles from Boston. So enough ties to go all the way from Boston to Raleigh, North Carolina. That's how much steel Carnegie built or Carnegie made for the New York system. At any rate, John McDonald was an Irish immigrant. He was a successful contractor who'd worked all over the country. The problem was he didn't have the $7 million at this point because William Whitney had gotten all of his banker friends to withdraw their pledges of $7 million, or whatever portion of that $7 million they had said they would loan to Mr. McDonald to build the railroad. So enter one more name that you might be familiar with, August Belmont there on the right side. Belmont, if any of you are into horses, Belmont Park, Belmont Stakes, that's him. Okay, that's where he put some of his money, and was from a very wealthy family. The Belmonts were one of the wealthiest families in New York and actually in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century. So Belmont steps in and gives the funding to McDonald. Together, they create the Interborough Rapid Transit Authority to run the New York subway system. And actually, this is where, at this point, Whitney gets on board, uses his influence in Albany to get the state legislature to approve all of this. So Whitney's one of those figures William Whitney, one of those figures who's kind of a villain at first, but then he kind of changes his mind and helps out. So construction began in March of 1900 through New York City. They discovered coin chests, colonial weapons. They even discovered mastodon bones near Dyckman Street. They discovered the charred hull of a 17th century Dutch ship near the Battery. And they discovered an assortment of underground springs and brooks, even a small subterranean pond near 32nd and Madison Avenue. So McDonald had experience tunneling and building, which was good, or the tunneling especially, because they were going to have to build more tunnels in New York City because of the way the subsurface was, or the ground was. So it was similar to tunneling that had been done for railroads. So about 5,000 miners were working in New York City to build the tunnels that would create the New York system. In New York, like Boston, they did cut and cover wherever they could, but that wasn't. Oops, there's one last picture of one of the first trains running through the Boston subway. So here's the system in New York City, the first system you see on the left there, which is, as you can see, way more ambitious than Boston. But then again, New York was much bigger than Boston, so of course the subway would be different. But that was the original line that they built, the 20 plus miles that they were going to build there. So the building of the New York system, the building of the New York system took about 4 years. And like Boston, there were a couple of disasters along the way. One of the worst disasters was, or the second worst, I should say, was a shack was used to store dynamite, and they stored way too much dynamite there for the size of the shack. A worker knocked a candle on the floor. Yeah, I wonder who thought it was a good idea to have candles and dynamite in the same room. But at any rate, knocked it on the floor. He made the mistake of knocking it on the floor, but he was also credited with getting people moved before the whole thing blew up. But ultimately, 6 people were killed and 125 people were injured in that explosion, which was mostly flying glass and other objects that did most of the damage. It's actually surprising that more people weren't killed with that much dynamite. But the worker, a guy named Moses Epps, John McDonald, the contractor, and a guy named Ira Schaller, who was the engineering subcontractor, were all arrested on murder charges as a result of that. Epps, the man who caused the explosion by his mistake, and McDonald were quickly released, but Schaller was not as lucky. He was injured later on in another explosion in the process, and then died from injuries sustained in that explosion, so obviously was never held accountable for that. There was another disaster when they were doing some tunneling in the Bronx. It had to be built, and in October of 1903, near Fort George at 193rd Street, there was a disaster. They exploded. They did their explosion, and normally they waited about 10 minutes before they would go into an explosion where they had done the explosion, so that give time for material to fall and the dust to settle and so forth. And they went in, and a huge rock fell from the ceiling. It was 5 feet wide and 44 feet long. It was estimated that it weighed about 300 tons, and it fell on the ceiling and killed 10 people there. So after 4 years and a lot of work, the New York City Railroad opened. That's the City Hall station under construction there. It opened in October of 1904. It had killed 54 people in its construction, so many more than in Boston. And about 4 years after Boston opened its railroad. So today, New York City has 248 miles of routes in its train system. It has 665 miles of track with double tracks and so forth. It has 472 stations, and in 2022 had nearly 1.8 billion rides. It's one of the largest subway systems in the world. Boston's T, in contrast, has about 69 miles of tracks. In 2022, it had about 31 million riders on the subway, with 147 stations. 31 of those are underground. In terms of riders per day, the T is the 4th busiest railroad or commuter railroad in the United States. And the commuter rail, I should say, the T is the 4th busiest subway in terms of riders. I misspoke. And the commuter rail system had about 81 million riders in 2022, making it the 3rd busiest when measured in terms of riders per day, the third busiest in the United States. So that concludes my talk about the competition. One last thing I would add, just because I thought it was interesting, George B. McClellan Jr. was the mayor of New York City, whose father was the Civil War general, George McClellan, who Lincoln famously said, "If you're not going to use your army, could I borrow it?" In 1862. And the mayor of Boston was a good old Boston name, one of the scions of the Blue Bloods of Boston. Josiah Quincy was the mayor of Boston in 1899 when the subway, or 1897, excuse me, when the subway opened. So I will turn it over to any questions that anybody has. Yes.
Sort of related questions.
Yep.
One is, what kind of communication systems did they build so that you could actually find out when there was a problem, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay.
And did they use telegraphs, or did they use phone wires, or what?
So the question was, two questions was, really, I'll combine it into one, was how did they communicate with the trains? And you had to ask the first question that's going to stump me. Doggone it. I'd made it 36 hours into the new year knowing everything. And now, I'll make an educated guess. And my educated guess is that they used telephones, because by this time, by circa 1900, telephones were fairly common in wealthy homes at least. So they would have had telephones. And in New York City, they probably could have used telegraph from one end to the other as well. So that's my best guess.
All right, so I also was wondering about the gauge. How did they decide on what gauge in each city? And did they have to take into account that some of them would be elevated tracks and some would be in the subways and tunnels?
I'm going to assume that the question was about gauge, and that's, if you don't know, gauge is the distance between the rails. So looking right here, this is the gauge here. By this time, most railroads in America were the standard 4 feet 8 inches. And I'm going to, again, I'm not sure, but though they would have made those probably the same for easier integration of those. They might have been a little narrower just because they were a little bit smaller, but they would have made them uniform for ease of integration of the system.
They would build the cars somewhere and transport them to Boston over the tracks.
Yes, the question was, they build the cars someplace else and transport them. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
On this opening slide, I was wondering if you knew where that incline was. Is that Boston?
It's Boston. I don't know where. The question was, on this opening slide, if I knew where that was. And no, I don't. It's Boston. I know that. Someone's saying Com Ave up here. Yeah, I can't read any of the signs. I think actually it just says go slow. I thought maybe I could read this sign, but it just says go slow. I'm sorry, it looks like it's near Fenway? Okay. 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 Well, that's a question I can research, and if I'm invited back, I'll tell you all the answer the next time I'm here. Yes.
I have a question. I think you said the elevated portions of the T are no longer in existence, and yet there's a lot of them still in New York. So what would be the difference there?
Why would Boston get rid of them and New York keep them? Probably for a number of reasons, being complaints about them. If people were complaining more, they would have been eliminated. The New York system is just bigger, and they've got much more area to cover, so it's not as practical to get rid of them as it would be in Boston. And then, city fathers use destruction of public transportation in some very not nice ways, which might have happened as well. It didn't happen in New York that might have happened in Boston. So, does that answer your question? Okay. Did you have a question?
People in Washington D.C. are very proud of the metro. And actually, if you take the metro, it's like so quiet and calm. Do you have any information about how that was built?
The question was that the folks in Washington are very proud of the metro and how quiet and nice that is, and any information about that being built. And the answer is not much, other than I know most of it was opened in like the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I was told, and I wouldn't swear by this, I was told that also part of the reason it was built and it's so deep is because it was built during the Cold War, or a lot of it was built during the Cold War. So it's much deeper. If you've ever ridden the metro in Washington, a lot of the stations, you got to go down a long ways in an escalator to get down to the train tracks. So I don't know much about that. I was blanking. Something else about Washington system, but I was blanking on. It is, compared to Boston, it is much nicer and it looks nicer and it's more aesthetically pleasing certainly than Boston's is. And I think part of that is done because the Boston system was built for commuters for Boston. The metro was built in DC very much with commuters and people coming from all over the country in mind as well, as a kind of a showcase for the city. My first experience riding subways a lot was in Washington, actually, when I was doing dissertation research. And I was riding it every day for like 2 months to go into the Library of Congress. And then I moved to Boston, and the first time I went in the Boston subway system, it was like, wow, this is really primitive compared to the metro. The rock walls, there's nothing there, and Washington's is all very polished and just very different.
London is way under the ground.
Yeah.
London is way under.
When New York opened, do you know how many miles that the first part of the New York subway?
It was about 20. Just that first. This map, and then it went up even a little bit further north yet.
It looks like it's the west side and then on the east side as well. Across the 32nd.
Yeah, just on this would be the west side, right? So the east side would have been built later on.
So the south part of that is the west side.
Yeah, the south part of this, I guess, would be the west side, but also just lower Manhattan into the financial district and so forth down there. I'm sorry?
I said I always think Grand Central is east.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is just, I guess, if there's a midline there, it would just be on the east side of that midline. Yes?
Do you know when each of these systems branched out to the suburbs?
Um,
Boston would go to Cambridge to Somerville, and New York was...
pretty quickly after they were built. I didn't trace the further development beyond just this to tell this little vignette or this little part of the story. You guys asked a lot of good questions that had me stumped, so that's a good thing though. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Okay. Thank you very much for coming out, folks. Hopefully see you again.